The Grand Conclave Chamber was the most powerful room in the known galaxy, and everyone inside it knew that very well. It floated in the neutral zone between 17 civilizations, a massive ring-shaped station that had existed for over 3,000 years. Every wall was carved from black starstone. Every seat at the great circular table was worth more than most planets, and every being who sat in those seats had spent decades earning the right to be there. Tonight, the chamber was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Ambassador Vale of the Crethan Dominion stood at the center podium. He was tall, gray-skinned, with 4 narrow eyes that caught the light like polished glass. He had served the Council for 60 years. He had seen wars end at this table. He had seen species collapse and species rise. He believed deeply and completely that the Council existed to keep the galaxy in order. That was why he had called this session. That was why he had spent the last 3 years preparing for this exact moment. He looked around the room at the 16 other ambassadors, and he began to speak. "The data is not in question," he said, his voice calm and measured, the kind of voice that had been trained over decades to sound reasonable even when saying unreasonable things. "The human species has been a member of this council for 40 years. In that time, they have colonized 30 worlds. They have developed 3 independent forms of faster-than-light travel. They have brokered peace between the Sorathi and the Ven, 2 species that had been at war for 900 years. They have done all of this without asking our permission, without slowing down, and without showing any sign that they intend to stop." He paused and let that sit in the air. "Every projection model we have run across every civilization represented in this room points to the same outcome. If humanity is allowed to continue at their current rate of growth, they will be the dominant force in this galaxy within 5 centuries. Not a force. The dominant force, one species controlling the shape of everything." The chamber stayed quiet. That was how Vale knew he had them. Ambassador Seath of the Voakai Collective leaned forward. She was small, blue, and ancient in a way that made her look like something carved from ice. "You are proposing a preemptive action," she said. "I am proposing a containment measure," Vale said. "There is a difference." There was a long silence. Then the arguments began. They lasted for 4 hours. Some ambassadors pushed back hard. The representative from the Thule Federation, a young species themselves by galactic standards, argued that what Vale was describing was simply fear disguised as strategy. The Haven Collective's ambassador said that striking a council member without provocation would set a precedent that could never be undone. Several others said nothing at all, which in council politics meant they were already decided and just waiting to see which way the room went. Vale answered every objection with data, charts, projections, historical parallels. He had prepared for every argument because he had run every argument through his own staff for 2 years before stepping into this room. He was not a man who left things to chance. And in the end, when the vote was called, the count came back 9-8 in favor. The Meridian Decree was passed. It was classified at the highest possible level. No record of it would leave this station. No human diplomat, no human intelligence network, no human anything would ever know this vote had happened. The Council's combined military arm would organize a strike force. The target would be Oros Prime, humanity's most populated colony world outside the Sol system. The goal was not total destruction. The goal was a message, delivered in the only language Vale believed humanity would understand quickly enough. Force. Overwhelming, undeniable, unmistakable force. Hit them hard enough that they stopped growing. Hit them hard enough that they looked inward instead of outward. Buy the galaxy another few centuries of balance. That was the plan. Vale's aide, a young Crethan named Sorvin who had worked with him for 6 years, walked beside him as they left the chamber through the private exit corridor. Sorvin had been in the observation booth during the vote. He had heard everything. He was quiet for a long time as they walked, which was unusual for him because Sorvin was almost never quiet. Finally he spoke. "Ambassador," he said, I have to ask something." "Then ask," Vale said. "Have any of the projections accounted for how humans respond to being attacked?" Vale did not slow his walk. "They will respond the way any young species responds to superior force. They will panic. Their governments will argue. Their people will fracture. They are not unified enough to mount a coordinated military response against the combined strength of the Council." Sorvin was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I have spent the last 3 years studying human history as part of my background research for your files. Every war they have ever fought, every crisis, every moment where outside pressure was applied to their civilization from a direction they did not expect." He paused. "Ambassador, I do not think they will panic." Vale stopped walking. He turned and looked at his aide. "What do you think they will do?" Sorvin met his eyes, which was rare for a junior aide addressing a senior ambassador. "I think they will stop arguing with each other," he said quietly. Vale looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and kept walking. "You worry too much," he said. "They are 40 years old in the stars. We have been here for 3,000. Send the order to the fleet." Sorvin sent the order. 400 Crethan warships, the finest in the Dominion's arsenal, were already positioned at the edge of human space. They had been moved there quietly over the past 8 months under the cover of a routine patrol expansion. No human sensor grid had flagged the movement, or at least no human sensor grid had reported flagging it. The fleet commander, Admiral Duvas, received the authorization code at 300 station time. He verified it 3 times because he was the kind of commander who verified things 3 times. Then he gave the order. The fleet dropped into faster-than-light travel. On Oros Prime, it was morning. The colony was 20 years old and had grown faster than anyone had predicted, which was true of most things humans built. The cities were spread across 4 continents. Farms stretched from coast to coast. The sky was a light, clean blue that the original settlers had fallen in love with immediately and had never stopped talking about. Children were going to school. Workers were heading to shipyards and research stations and crop fields. Everything was ordinary in the way that life becomes ordinary when it has been safe for long enough. Then the Crethan fleet came out of FTL above the planet's northern hemisphere and opened fire. The orbital defense platforms were destroyed in the first 90 seconds. 3 of the colony's major power relay stations were hit in the next 3 minutes. The capital city's government center was struck at the 6-minute mark. Emergency broadcasts went out across every channel, but the communication satellites were being targeted as well, and the signals were already breaking up. 2.3 million people were in the direct impact zones in those first 6 hours. The feeds reached Earth 17 minutes after the first strike. Automated relay systems picked them up and pushed them to every screen on every human world in the network before any government official had time to decide whether the footage should be released or contained. It did not matter anyway. Humans had spent decades building redundant communication networks specifically because they did not trust single points of failure. The footage was everywhere before anyone could stop it. In the Grand Conclave Chamber, now empty and dark, the voting record of the Meridian Decree sat in an encrypted file that only 9 beings in the galaxy could access. Vale was in his private quarters watching the Oros Prime feeds on a secure monitor. He watched the fires and the broken skyline and he felt, if not satisfaction, then at least the cold certainty of a man who believed he had done what needed to be done. His monitor showed a secondary feed, human news networks, live, unfiltered. They were not panicking. He watched the anchors. He watched the government officials who were already appearing on screens. He watched the ordinary people in the streets of cities on Earth and Mars and a dozen other worlds, standing still, looking up at screens in public squares, watching the same footage he was watching. Their faces were not afraid. Their faces were something else entirely, something Vale did not have a word for in his own language. Something that lived in the space between grief and a decision that has already been made. He kept watching, and for the first time since he had called the council session 3 years ago, Ambassador Vale felt something he had not planned for. He felt uncertain. The first thing the president of the Terran Union did when the Auro's Prime footage reached her desk was close her office door and stand very still for exactly 4 minutes. Her senior staff waited outside in the corridor, not speaking, not moving, just waiting. They had all seen the feeds. They all knew what was coming. They were waiting to find out what shape it would take. When she opened the door, her face was calm. Her eyes were not. "Get me every head of state on a live line," she said. "Every colony governor, every fleet admiral, every defense minister. I want them all in the same call within the next 2 hours. And someone find out where that fleet came from because I want that answer before the call starts." Her staff moved. That was the thing about the Terran Union's leadership apparatus. It had been built across generations to move fast when it needed to, because humans had learned a long time ago that slow governments got their people killed. Within 40 minutes, the intelligence answer came back. The hull markings on the attacking ships were Crethan. The fleet's point of origin, based on trajectory analysis, was consistent with a staging area in the Dominion's outer patrol zone that had quietly grown from a standard 6-ship rotation to over 400 warships across the past 8 months. The intelligence chief who delivered the report placed it on the president's desk and then said, very carefully, "There is one more thing." He slid a second file across. "Our long-range passive monitoring picked up a tight beam communication from the Conclave station to the Crethan Fleet Command approximately 19 hours before the attack. We could not decrypt the content, but we can confirm the origin point." The president looked at the file, then she looked at him. "The council authorized this," she said. "It was not a question." He said nothing. He didn't need to. When the joint call began, it included 47 heads of state, 19 colonial governors, and 12 fleet admirals spread across every human world in the network. The connection had latency issues because some of the outer colonies were far enough out that real-time communication required relay chains, but they made it work because they had built the relay chains for exactly this kind of moment. The call lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. For the first hour, people argued. That was expected and even necessary because humans did not trust unified decisions that happened without argument. The arguments covered the full range. Was the intelligence on the council's involvement solid enough? What were the legal frameworks under the Compact Treaty? What was the proportionate response? Who had the authority to authorize a military action of the scale being discussed? And a dozen other questions that all needed to be heard out loud before they could be set aside. But something was different about this argument, and everyone on the call felt it even if no one said it directly. There was no faction pushing for inaction. There was no bloc trying to use the crisis for internal political leverage. There was no subgroup trying to quietly position itself to benefit from whatever came next. The attack on Auro's Prime had killed 2.3 million people who had done nothing except live in a colony that another civilization decided was a useful target. And every human on that call, regardless of what world they came from or what political position they held, shared one thing in their gut that was louder than any argument. This was not a dispute to be managed. This was an answer to be given. By the second hour, the arguments had narrowed. By the third hour, a framework existed. In the final 40 minutes, the Unified Emergency Mandate was drafted, reviewed, and signed by every participant on the call. It was the first document in human history to carry the simultaneous authorization of every governing body in human space. It suspended all inter-colony political disputes for the duration of the crisis. It centralized military command under a single structure. It authorized whatever resource allocation was required, and it named Admiral Seraph Voss as the commander of the newly designated Terran Expeditionary Force. The choice of Voss was not controversial. She had spent 30 years in human fleet operations, the last 12 as commander of the Outer Rim Defense Network. She was known for two things: She did not lose, and she did not waste. Every campaign she had ever run had been completed faster and with fewer casualties than anyone projected on both sides. When junior officers asked her what the key to that record was, she always gave the same answer: know exactly what you are trying to achieve before you move a single ship. She received the appointment notification while she was already on a transport heading toward the Outer Rim Command Station. She had seen the RO's prime feeds like everyone else. She had not waited to be called. She had already started moving. When she arrived at the command station and walked into the primary operations center, the staff who had been working the room for the past 12 hours stood automatically, not because protocol required it, because of who she was and what her presence meant. It meant the thinking phase was over. She stood in front of the main strategic display, which showed every ship in the human fleet at its current position. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to her chief of intelligence. "Show me the real charts," she said. He knew exactly what she meant. He pulled up a second overlay, not the official star charts that the Council had provided to humanity during the treaty process 40 years ago, the ones with certain systems conveniently left vague or incorrectly mapped, but the charts that human survey ships had been quietly building for the past 20 years through a combination of independent deep space probes, commercial shipping data, and some very careful intelligence work that had never been officially sanctioned, but had also never been officially stopped. The real charts were significantly more detailed than the official ones. They showed the actual locations of Council fleet stations, supply depots, communication relay hubs, and military infrastructure across 17 systems. They showed patrol routes. They showed response times. They showed gaps. Voss studied them without speaking for almost 10 minutes. No one in the room spoke either. Then she picked up a marker and began to draw lines on the display. "We are not defending," she said, and her voice was the same quiet tone she always used, the one that somehow carried to every corner of every room she ever stood in. "Defending tells them that hitting us is a strategy that works. We are not going to teach them that." She drew another line. "We are going to answer." She turned to face the room. "Get me the shipyard output numbers, all of them, official capacity, actual capacity, and surge capacity." The numbers came back within minutes. The official capacity of human shipyards across all worlds was substantial. The actual current output was running at around 30% of that because peacetime economics did not require full production. The surge capacity, what the yards could produce if every civilian contract was suspended, every reserve workforce activated, every material allocation redirected, was a number that made two of the junior staff members in the room go very quiet when they saw it. Voss looked at the surge number and nodded once. "Activate all yards to full surge immediately," she said. "I also want the archive files on the Vega-class heavy carrier and the longbow destroyer line." Her chief of staff hesitated. "Those designs were shelved," he said carefully. "The Council diplomatic team flagged them during the treaty review as being inconsistent with the spirit of the mutual defense framework." Voss looked at him. "The Council just killed 2.3 million of our people," she said. "Pull the files." The files were pulled. The designs were approved within the hour. Shipyards that had been operating at quiet peacetime rhythms began to change their sound. The shift was physical. You could feel it in the station decks, in the vibration of fabrication bays cycling up to speeds they had not run at in years. Materials that had been sitting in reserve storage began to move. Workers who had been on standard rotations began receiving recall notices. Across every human world, the same change was happening, not in a panicked way, not in a chaotic way, in the focused, organized, deeply purposeful way that humans moved when they had decided on something completely. On the Conclave Station, Council Intelligence Director S. Savith was watching the human feeds with his full staff. They had been monitoring since the Oro's prime strike, looking for the panic response, the political fracturing, the internal blame cycles that should have been fragmenting human attention by now. Instead, his analysts kept bringing him the same reports: unified government action, shipyard activation, fleet repositioning, the unified emergency mandate signed by everyone. Savith was 400 years old. He had watched civilizations do many things under pressure. He had never seen anything quite like this. "Where is their fleet moving?" he asked. "That is the issue," his lead analyst said. "We are tracking approximately 400 of their ships on standard patrol and defensive repositioning, but we are calculating that their total active fleet should be significantly larger than that based on known registry numbers." She paused. "Director, we cannot find approximately 1,200 of their warships." The room was very quiet. Savith looked at the display for a long time. 1,200 ships did not simply disappear. They went somewhere. The question was where, and the worst question was why he could not see them. He thought about what that meant for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "We just signed our own doom." Nobody in the room contradicted him. Across human space, Admiral Seraph Voss stood in front of her completed deployment map and looked at 17 marked positions in Council space that no Council intelligence officer knew she had data on. She had spent 12 years building this information. She had never been sure she would need it. She was sure now. "Execute Phase 1, she said, and the Terran Expeditionary Force moved. Grand Admiral Duvas had commanded the Crethan fleet for 22 years and he had never lost a battle. That was not arrogance on his part, it was simply the record. He had fought 7 engagements against 3 different species, and in every case the outcome had followed the same pattern: superior numbers, superior firepower, controlled application of force. His fleet was the finest the Dominion had ever assembled, and he knew it the way a craftsman knows a good tool, with quiet confidence and zero doubt. He did not feel quiet confidence right now. He was standing on the command bridge of his flagship, the KDS Eternal Reach, watching his tactical displays with an expression his crew had never seen on his face before. They didn't have a name for it. It was somewhere between confusion and the beginning of understanding something you very much did not want to understand. The Council's Combined Response Fleet, assembled after the Oros Prime strike to intercept any human military movement at the border, had been in position for 6 days. 3,000 ships from 9 member species, positioned at every logical entry point into Council space from human territory. The defensive grid was, by any reasonable strategic calculation, impenetrable. You could not move a fleet of any meaningful size through that border without being detected, intercepted, and stopped. The humans had not come through the border. The first report had come from the Voakai relay station in the Aldine system, 40 light-years inside Council space. The station had gone dark without warning, without a distress signal, without any indication of trouble before the moment it stopped transmitting. The second report, or rather, the absence of a report, came from the fuel depot at Kersh Point, which missed its standard check-in and then missed the follow-up check-in as well. Then the communication hub at Tesvar went dark. Then the military supply station at Grid 9. All of them inside Council space. All of them hit cleanly and quietly. All of them done before anyone on the Council's border fleet had any idea something was wrong. Duvas had requested a full strategic assessment, and the answer that came back from his intelligence staff was delivered by a young analyst named Veth who looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days, because she hadn't. She placed her report on his desk and then explained it out loud because she could tell from his face that he needed to hear it as well as read it. "They were already inside our space before we finished assembling the border fleet," she said. "Based on the timing of the first station loss and the last confirmed position data we have for their vessels, we believe they repositioned covert supply and support ships inside our territory over a period of several months, disguised as civilian transports. When their main fleet moved, it did not come through the border. It came through us." She paused. "Sir, They have been inside our space for at least 8 months. Duvas looked at the report. How many of their ships? We do not have a firm count. Based on the speed and scale of what they have hit so far, we estimate the force operating inside our space is somewhere between 800 and 1,200 warships. The number sat in the air between them. And the border fleet is positioned to stop them coming in, Duvas said, mostly to himself. Yes, sir, Veth said. They are facing the wrong direction. He ordered the border fleet to reposition immediately. But repositioning 3,000 ships was not a fast process, and by the time the reorientation was underway, the Terran Expeditionary Force had already hit 11 more targets. Not destroyed them, hit them. That was the word Duvas kept coming back to as the damage reports arrived, because destroyed would have been more familiar. He knew how to process destroyed. What the humans were doing was something more precise, and in its own way, more unsettling. The fleet fuel depot at Kersh Point had been disabled, not blown apart. The power generation systems were gone, the docking infrastructure was heavily damaged, but the main structure was intact and the emergency life support was still running. The crew had survived, every one of them. The relay station at Aldine had been taken offline by what the engineering report described as a targeted strike on the signal amplification arrays. The station could not communicate, but it was not a wreck. The crew had received a broadcast on a local frequency from the attacking ships 14 minutes before the strike telling them to move to the protected interior sections. All of them had. Every target the humans hit was hit the same way. Disable, not destroy. Take the military or strategic value off the board without turning it into a graveyard. And always, there was the warning broadcast first, giving the crews enough time to get clear of the most dangerous sections. Duvas called his tactical staff together and showed them the pattern. They looked at it in silence for a while. Then his senior tactical officer, a veteran named Commander Rail who had been in fleet operations for 30 years, said, "They are not trying to punish us." "No," Duvas said. "They are trying to win," Rail said, and there was something strange in his voice. A kind of reluctant respect that a warrior could not fully suppress when he saw another warrior doing something brilliantly. They have decided what winning looks like, and they are moving toward it in a straight line. They are not being distracted by the chance to cause more damage than is necessary. Duvas nodded. "And that," he said quietly, "is what makes them more dangerous than anything we prepared for." The actual engagement, when the two fleets finally found each other in the Tesvar corridor, lasted 11 days. Duvas had approximately 600 ships in the sector by the time he managed to get them repositioned. The Terran force he was facing numbered, his analysts believed, around 900. The battles were spread across 4 separate engagement zones, and none of them followed any tactical pattern the Krethan fleet had trained against. The humans did not mass their firepower the way standard doctrine said you were supposed to. They split their forces into smaller, faster groups that moved in coordinated patterns, hitting different sections of his formation simultaneously, pulling his ships out of their defensive configurations, creating gaps, and then using those gaps before they could close. When Duvas tried to concentrate his forces to match one of the human strike groups, 2 others would appear on a different vector. When he tried to hold a position, the human groups would simply move around it and keep hitting things behind him. His ships were not being destroyed in large numbers. That was the other thing. The engagement was not a slaughter. It was a systematic, methodical, deeply professional dismantling. His fleet's capacity to operate as a unit was being taken apart piece by piece. Drive systems, weapons arrays. Communication links between ships. The humans targeted the things that made a fleet rather than just a collection of individual ships. And they were good at it in a way that told Duvas these were not tactics being improvised in the field. These were tactics that had been planned and trained for a long time. On the 5th day of the engagement, he received a short-range communication from the Terran fleet flagship. It was not a demand for surrender. It was not a threat. It was a single sentence from the Terran fleet commander. "Admiral Duvas, you are fighting well, but you cannot win this engagement. I would rather stop adding to either side's casualty list. Open a command channel when you are ready to talk." He did not open the channel. He kept fighting for 6 more days because he was Crethan, and stopping was not something that came naturally to his people. On the 11th day, with less than 40% of his fleet still combat-capable, and his own flagship running on backup power after losing 2 engine arrays, he opened the channel. The voice on the other end was calm, unhurried, and not unkind. "Thank you, Admiral," she said. They spoke for 20 minutes. The terms were not what he expected. There were no terms, in the traditional sense of a defeated commander being told what he owed the victor. Admiral Voss told him that his surviving ships would be given whatever repair support the Terran engineering teams could provide. His crews would be given food, medical attention, and safe passage back to Crethan space. His wounded would be treated by human medical staff before his own people could reach them. And when they were ready to leave, he and every surviving member of his fleet would be given a single data chip. "What is on the chip?" he asked. "A message," she said, "for the Council." He was quiet for a moment. "And what do you want in return for this?" There was a brief pause on the line. "I want you to go home," she said, "and I want you to tell every person you pass on the way what happened here and how it ended and what we chose not to do when we had the chance." Another pause. "And I want the Council to understand that what they have seen so far is not our full response. Tell them that specifically." Duvas sat in the dim light of his damaged bridge for a long time after the call ended. His first officer was watching him from across the room. "She let us go," the first officer said. "Yes," Duvas said. "Why?" Duvas thought about the 11 days of fighting he had just been through. He thought about the warnings before every strike. He thought about the way the engagement had been conducted, with total competence and no cruelty. He thought about what it meant that a species capable of this had chosen to fight it this way. "Because they are not trying to punish us," he said, the same words his tactical officer had used at the beginning of all this, but meaning something much larger now. "They decided what winning looks like, and this is part of it." He stood up slowly and took the data chip from the courier who brought it aboard. He turned it over in his hand. It was a small thing to carry something as heavy as what was on it. He tucked it into his uniform pocket and began the long process of bringing his broken fleet home. The Grand Conclave Chamber had held emergency sessions before, but none of them had looked quite like this. The great circular table was still there, still carved from black starstone, still worth more than most planets. The seats of 17 civilizations were still arranged in their ancient order, but the windows that ran along the outer wall of the chamber, the long curved panels of transparent alloy that showed open space, now showed something different from the usual view of distant stars. They showed Terran warships. 40 of them, positioned in a loose arc around the conclave station, close enough that you could make out the hull markings with standard optical equipment. They were not powering weapons. They were not broadcasting threats. They were simply there, visible and unmistakable, the way a very large and very calm person standing in a doorway is visible and unmistakable. Ambassador Vale looked at them from his seat and then looked away, because looking at them too long did something to his composure that he did not want the rest of the chamber to see. The emergency session had been called after Duvas's fleet returned to Crethan space, and the debriefing reports began circulating through Council intelligence channels. The reports were comprehensive, and Duvas was, to his credit, completely honest in them. He did not minimize what had happened or try to reframe it in terms that were easier to deliver. He described the engagement exactly as it had been, a systematic, professional defeat by a force that had been better prepared, better informed, and operating from a strategic position that the Council had not known existed. He described the tactics. He described the warnings before strikes. He described how his crews had been treated afterward. He also delivered the message from the data chip in full, which was the part that had triggered the emergency session. The chip contained two things. The first was a summary of what the Terran Expeditionary Force had done and could continue to do, written in plain language without exaggeration, which made it more frightening than exaggeration would have. It listed the infrastructure that had been disabled, the systems that were now under Terran operational influence, and the current positions of human fleet elements within Council space. It was specific and it was verifiable, and every intelligence team in every Council member state had spent 3 days verifying it and coming back with the same answer. All of it was accurate. The second thing on the chip was a single line: send someone to talk, send someone young. The Council had argued about that line for almost as long as they had argued about the strategic summary. What did it mean, send someone young? Was it an insult? Was it a condition? Was it a signal of some kind? Eventually, the interpretation that most of them settled on was the simplest one, which was that the humans did not want to talk to the people who had voted for the Meridian Decree. They wanted someone who had not been in that room. The decision of who to send fell, after considerable argument, to the Council Secretariat, which selected Commander Danny Ockafer of the Terran Diplomatic Liaison Office. But then everyone realized that the instruction was directed at the Council, not at humanity, and that the humans had already decided who they were sending, and it was the Council that needed to send someone young in response. The confusion lasted another half-day before it was resolved, and in the end the Council sent a junior ambassador from the Thule Federation named Resha, who was the youngest serving ambassador in the Council's current membership, and who had, notably, voted against the Meridian Decree. Resha arrived at the Conclave Station at the same time as the Terran representative. Commander Danny Ockafer was 31 years old, which made her look extremely young to species who measured their careers in centuries. She was not particularly tall. She wore a standard Terran diplomatic uniform with no decorations except the rank insignia and one small pin on her lapel that Resha later learned was a flag from Oros Prime. She carried a single case and had no entourage. She shook Resha's hand at the docking port and said, "Good to meet you. Shall we get started?" They walked into the chamber together. The 17 ambassadors who were present watched Ockafer move to the human seat at the table, the seat that human diplomats had occupied for 40 years as guests, as juniors, as the newest and youngest voice in a room full of ancient authority. She set her case on the table and opened it and removed 2 documents and placed them side by side in front of her. Then she looked around the room with the unhurried attention of someone who has absolutely nothing to prove and knows it. Vale was watching her from his seat. He had read everything the Council's intelligence services had assembled on Ockafer in the past 3 days. She was career diplomatic corps, no significant field experience, no military background. She had been assigned to the Outer Liaison Office 18 months ago. There was nothing in her file that explained why Admiral Voss had sent her specifically. But sitting across from her now, watching the way she held the room without doing anything to hold it, Vale thought he was beginning to understand. She had been sent because she was exactly what she looked like: young, steady, and completely unimpressed. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Ockafer said. Her voice was clear and level and carried to every part of the chamber without her raising it. "I want to be straightforward about why I'm here. Because I think we've all had enough of things being handled indirectly." No one spoke. The room stayed with her. "The Meridian Decree was a decision made in this chamber by people who are in this room," she said. "You authorized a military strike on a civilian world without warning, without declaration, without any attempt at communication first. 2.3 million people died in the first 6 hours. You know the number. I'm saying it out loud because I want it to be in the record of this session rather than in a classified file that 9 people can access." Still no one spoke. 1 or 2 of the ambassadors looked at the table. Vale kept his eyes on her. "Admiral Voss sent me here to deliver 2 things," Ockafer said, and she slid the first document toward the center of the table. This is the Bill of Reclassification. The Terran Union is formally removing itself from the Council's species classification system, effective immediately. We are withdrawing from the treaty framework that designated this body as the governing authority for interspecies relations in this region of space. She let that sit for a moment. This is not a negotiating position. This is a notification. The room broke. Not violently, but decisively, voices came from multiple directions at once, some outraged, some alarmed, some asking procedural questions that were really just expressions of panic in a formal format. Resha, sitting in the Thule seat, stayed quiet and watched Akafar. Akafar waited. She did not appear uncomfortable. She appeared to be waiting in the same way a person waits for rain to pass, with no expectation that the rain cares about their schedule and no particular distress about it. When the voices died down enough, she continued as though there had been no interruption. "The second document," she said, and slid the other page forward, "is an invitation." She looked around the table. The Terran Compact is a new framework for interspecies cooperation. It is built on 3 principles: complete transparency in governance decisions that affect other species, mutual non-aggression with enforcement mechanisms that apply equally to all members, and full sovereignty for every member without classification hierarchies. She paused. Any species that wishes to engage with human space, for trade, for travel, for diplomatic communication, will do so under this framework and these terms. "You are dismantling 3,000 years of galactic order," said the ambassador from the Haven Collective, and his voice held genuine distress. "No," Akafar said, and for the first time there was something in her voice that was not quite neutral, not anger, but a precision that was sharper than the surrounding calm. "The Meridian Decree dismantled it. We are building something to replace it." She looked directly at him. "You can be part of that or you cannot be part of it, but the order you are describing is the one that authorized the killing of 2.3 million civilians to protect itself. We are not going to rebuild that." There was a long silence. Then the Thule ambassador, Resha, reached across the table and picked up the invitation document and read it carefully. The room watched him do it. When he finished, he looked up at Akafar and said simply, "Where do I sign?" 3 other ambassadors reached for the document almost immediately after that. Vale did not reach for it. He sat with his hands flat on the table and watched as the room slowly, irrevocably, began to change shape around him. He thought about the projection models that had started all of this. The ones that showed humanity becoming the dominant force in the galaxy within 5 centuries. He had looked at those models and seen a threat. He had looked at them and made a decision. He wondered, sitting in the ruin of that decision, whether he had ever thought to ask what humanity intended to do with that dominance, whether it had occurred to him that the answer might be different from what he assumed. He thought it had not. Akafar was preparing to leave. She closed her case with a quiet, final sound. She stood, straightened her uniform, and picked up her case. She looked around the room one more time with that same unhurried attention. "We tried to end us," she said, not dramatically, not as a parting shot, but simply as a statement of fact, the way you might state the weather. "We chose not to end you." She nodded once to Resha and once to the room generally. "The invitation is open. There is no deadline. We are not going anywhere." She walked out of the chamber. In the corridor outside, her aide was waiting. He fell into step beside her and they walked toward the docking port without speaking for a while. "How did it go?" he finally asked. "4 signed," she said. "Maybe 2 more by tomorrow based on their body language." "And the Crethan ambassador?" Akafar was quiet for a few steps. "He's thinking," she said. "That's more than he was doing before we came." Behind her in the chamber, Vale's aide Sorvin had quietly moved to the table and picked up the invitation document. He looked at his ambassador's back for a moment. Then he placed the document directly in front of Vale where he could not avoid seeing it. Vale looked at it for a long time without touching it. On the other side of the station's hull, framed in the long observation windows, the Terran warships held their positions in the quiet dark, patient and unhurried, and very, very present. The detention facility on Crethan Prime was not a cruel place, but it was not a comfortable one either. It was built for function rather than dignity, a low stone building at the edge of the capital city, surrounded by a security perimeter that was more symbolic than practical, because the person inside it had nowhere to go, and both of them knew it. Ambassador Vale had been confined there for 3 months, since the political tribunal had begun its slow, formal process of deciding what to do with the man who had cast the deciding vote for the Meridian Decree. He spent most of his days reading. There was not much else to do. The tribunal proceedings arrived in summary form each morning, and he read them carefully and then set them aside, because there was very little in them that surprised him anymore. He had made a decision. He had been wrong in ways that had killed millions of people and destabilized the most significant governing framework in the galaxy's modern history. The tribunal was going to reach a conclusion about that eventually, and whatever it was, he would accept it, because it was the only honest thing left available to him. On a morning in the 4th month, his guard told him he had a visitor. He expected Sorvin, who came every 2 weeks with updates on the compact negotiations and news from the wider galaxy. He did not expect the person who walked through the door. Admiral Seraph Voss looked exactly as she looked in every image he had ever seen of her, which was to say she looked like someone who had never wasted a single moment of her life and did not intend to start. She was in civilian clothes, not a uniform. No aide, no security detail. She carried nothing. She sat down across the small table from him as though they had met here many times before, and this was simply the next meeting in a long series. Vale stared at her. "Ambassador," she said. "Admiral," he said, and then, because he did not know what else to say, "This is unexpected." "I imagined so," she said. She looked around the room briefly, taking it in with the efficient attention of someone cataloging information they might need later, and then she looked back at him. "I wanted to speak with you directly. I was not sure the tribunal process would provide that opportunity, and I thought it was worth having the conversation before it closes." He folded his hands on the table. "You have come a considerable distance for a conversation," he said. "Some conversations are worth the distance," she said. There was a quiet between them that was not entirely uncomfortable. Voss seemed in no hurry to fill it, and Vale found, unexpectedly, that he was not either. He looked at her across the table and tried to see, in the person sitting there, the commander who had taken apart the finest fleet his civilization had ever assembled in 11 days. He could not quite make the two things align. She looked like someone's senior academic advisor. "Why did you come?" he asked. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. "One question." "Then ask it." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" The word was plain and direct, stripped of everything else. He understood immediately that she did not mean the tactical justification or the strategic projection data or the political process that had led to the vote. She meant the real reason, the one underneath all of those things. He was quiet for a long time. The honest answer was not one he had said out loud to anyone, including himself. In a clear and undefended form, he had always dressed it in data and frameworks and the language of responsibility to the galactic order. "Fear," he said finally. "We were afraid." He looked at his hands on the table. 200 years of projection modeling across every methodology we had, all of it pointing toward the same outcome. A species like humanity, unconstrained, growing at the rate they were growing, becoming something the rest of the galaxy would have no meaningful ability to influence or check within 5 centuries. He paused. "We looked at those models and we saw the end of everything we had built. And we decided that the only way to prevent it was to act before it was too late to act." Voss listened to all of this without changing her expression. "That is what the data told us," Vale said, "and we believed the data." You ran the projections, Voss said. Yes. And you saw the outcome. Yes. She leaned forward slightly. We ran the same projections, she said. Our analysts working independently using our own models. We got the same numbers you got. Same timeline, same dominance curve, same conclusion about where humanity was heading. She held his eyes. We made a different decision. He stared at her. What decision? We decided to use it to lift everyone else up, she said. We looked at those numbers and we thought, if we are going to be the largest force in this part of the galaxy in 500 years, then the most important thing we can do right now is make sure that everyone else is strong enough, developed enough, and connected enough that our size does not become their problem. She sat back. You should have asked us what we were planning before you fired the first shot, Ambassador. The room was very quiet. Vale looked at her for a long time. He thought about 60 years of service to a council that had believed it was protecting the galaxy. He thought about the vote, and Sorvin's voice saying, I don't think they will panic, and the fires on Oros Prime that he had watched on a secure monitor with the cold certainty of a man who believed he had done what needed to be done. I did not ask, he said, and his voice was very quiet, because I did not consider that the answer might be something I wanted to hear. Voss nodded once slowly. I would like to show you something, she said. If you are willing to travel, I can arrange it with the tribunal, a supervised visit, full transparency, whatever conditions they require. What would you show me? He asked. Something we have been building, she said, for 15 years, quietly. The tribunal approved the visit in 4 days, which was extremely fast for a body that had been deliberating for 4 months. But the request had come from Admiral Voss personally, and the tribunal members were not, in the end, willing to be the people who told her no. They traveled together on a Terran transport, Voss and Vale and 2 Crethan security officers who were there to satisfy the tribunal's requirements, and spent most of the journey trying not to look like they were fascinated by the ship they were on. The journey took 3 days. Voss spent part of it working at a desk in the common area. She did not attempt to fill the time with conversation, which Vale found, unexpectedly, that he appreciated. On the 3rd day they came out of faster-than-light travel, and the thing was there in front of them. Vale stood at the observation port and looked at it for a very long time. It was vast in a way that was difficult to process. The construction extended across an area of space that took several minutes to fully take in, even from a distance. Enormous ring structures, hundreds of them, in varying stages of completion, connected by framework and supply lines and the moving lights of thousands of construction ships. Jump gates, he recognized the architecture, but on a scale nothing in the known galaxy had ever attempted. A relay network that would connect species across distances that currently took decades to cross, cutting travel times to fractions of what they were, making the outer reaches of explored space as accessible as neighboring systems. And it would benefit everyone. That was the part he kept returning to as he stood there looking at it. The design was not proprietary. It was not built to give humanity a travel advantage. The gate architecture was open source, already distributed to every species in the Terran Compact, fully replicable by anyone with sufficient engineering capacity. Humanity was building the network and then giving it away because the goal was not to be faster than everyone else. The goal was to make everyone faster together. How long have you been building this? Vale asked. 15 years, Voss said from beside him. The Council's intelligence services, he said slowly. They knew about this. 3 of their agencies had reports on it, yes. He turned to look at her, and they did not flag it as a threat. They did not know what to do with it, she said. They kept waiting for the strategic purpose to become clear, the hidden angle, the reason we were doing it that would make sense in the framework they were using to analyze us. She looked at the construction ahead of them. They filed it as possible disinformation and moved on because the alternative, that we were building this for the reason it appeared to be built for, did not fit the model they had of us. Vale was quiet for a very long time. The construction ships moved in their slow, purposeful patterns ahead of them, each one doing its small part in something enormous, each one part of a project that had been planned and funded and worked on across 15 years by a species that had simultaneously been negotiating council membership, colonizing 30 worlds, and developing 3 new forms of faster-than-light travel. He thought about the projection models again, the 500-year dominance curve, the numbers that had looked like a threat. He thought about what it meant that those same numbers had looked, to the people they described, like a responsibility. "I was wrong," he said. "It came out plainly, without performance, the way simple true things sometimes do when you have been carrying them long enough that you are tired of the weight." Voss did not say anything. She let the words exist without adding to them. He looked at the network being built ahead of them, and then he made a decision. A small one in the physical sense, nothing more than a thought forming and being accepted. But it felt, from the inside, like the largest thing he had done in 60 years of service. "When we return," he said, "I would like to speak with Sorvin about the invitation." Weiss nodded, that was all. 6 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday, a document arrived at the Terran Compact's administrative office on Earth. It bore the official seal of the Crethan Dominion and the signature of a retired ambassador who was still technically awaiting a tribunal conclusion, but had been released to house arrangement pending that conclusion. It was the 17th and final application for membership in the Compact. An automated confirmation went back within seconds. It read, "Welcome, we're glad you're here." In a long archive building at the edge of the capital on Voakai Prime, a historian named Seth sat at her desk and looked at the document she was supposed to be finishing. It was the official record of what the Compact Archive had designated the Meridian War, a 4-month conflict that had reshaped the political structure of the known galaxy more completely than anything in the past 1,000 years. She had been working on it for 8 months. She was good at her work. The facts were all correct. The timeline was accurate. The strategic and political analysis was solid. But she had been sitting for 3 hours in front of the final summary line, and she could not finish it, because she could not find words that were accurate and also small enough to fit in a summary line. She thought about what had actually happened. 17 civilizations had looked at one species and decided they were too dangerous to be allowed to exist as they were. And that species had looked back at all 17 of them and made a decision that was, in terms of pure strategic logic, almost inexplicable, to answer overwhelming betrayal with a demonstration of what they were actually capable of, followed by an immediate and genuine offer to share it. She thought about the relay network, still being built at the edge of explored space. She thought about the Compact, 17 members and growing. She thought about Admiral Voss sitting across a small table from the man who had voted to destroy her people's home worlds, asking him one question, and then listening to the answer without judgment. She picked up her pen. She wrote, 17 civilizations looked at humanity and saw a threat. Humanity looked back and saw a family it had not met yet. The war lasted 4 months. The lesson lasted forever. She looked at it for a moment, then she closed the file. Outside the archive's long windows, the city was doing what cities do, moving, building, living, continuing, under a sky that was the same as it had always been. The stars were where they had always been, but the space between them was different now, threaded with new connections and new understanding, built by a species that had decided, when given the chance to become what everyone feared, to become something else instead. The file was closed, the record was complete, the galaxy kept turning.